Good morning, you're watching Business World Live. I'm Dani Laurel.
And I'm Jess De Los Santos. Here are the biggest stories to kickstart this trading day Wednesday. With inflation accelerating to a 42-month high in May, the Bangko Sentral says inflationary risks now lean toward the upside for this year. The BSP vows to review its inflation and growth outlook ahead of the Monetary Board meeting this June.
Now, incoming Bangko Sentral Governor Felipe Medalla hints at 2 more rate hikes this year in a bid to curb inflation.
For its part, the Trade Department says it's negotiating with manufacturers to stagger the increase in prices of basic commodities.
And the Finance Department says the government can slash its budget deficit without sacrificing infrastructure spending. We begin our broadcast with the Bangko Sentral admitting that the inflation outlook now leans towards the upside for 2022 as well as next year.
That's after inflation sizzled to a 3-year high of 5.4% in May. The central bank says risks will emanate from the impact of higher oil prices and the continued shortage in domestic pork and fish supply. However, the BSP reiterates that inflation path continues to be driven by supply-side factors, with supply chain disruptions also seen to contribute to upside risks. The BSP also vowed to continue to review price developments ahead of the Monetary Board meeting on June 23rd. So far, the Consumer Price Index has averaged at 4.1% this year, reaching the BSP target band for 2022 of 2 to 4%. Meanwhile, NEDA says an extension of EO 171, which lowers the tariff rates for rice and pork imports, may help ease inflationary pressures. So much to talk about after that inflation print. Let's not waste time and get right to it with our guest this morning, incoming BSP Governor, and currently sits at the Monetary Board, Felipe Medalla. Felipe Medalla, good morning. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Good morning. It's my privilege.
All right. In a previous interview, you did mention, you signaled the possibility of at least 2 more rate hikes here, one in June and another one in August. Now, to bring the benchmark by at least to 2.75%. Question is, what would warrant another rate hike here? And the rate things are going, how long do you see this cycle extending?
Okay. As you said earlier in the news, you said that largely the cause of the high inflation is supply shocks. Now, normally, we will not react to that. But there are 2 reasons we are reacting. The first one is the economy has recovered, and we're now reaching a point where demand and supply are just about balanced. On the aggregate. Of course, there are sectors where it's there are sectors where there's excess supply, there are sectors where excess demand. On the balance, on the aggregate, they're balanced. So, in other words, the conditions are such that supply shocks can have second-order effects that can result in the inflation spreading to the other sectors. Now, but at the moment, right now, the number of items in the Consumer Price Index that are between 2 and 4 far outnumber those that are above 4. And in addition, we do not see an upward trend in those items. But with the size of the supply shocks, and the fact that there are several of them, right? You have oil, you have wheat, you have, of course, the pork shortage because of the Asian swine flu. So those, the supply shocks together with what is now more or less a balance between almost equality of demand and supply, we must really take early measures before inflationary expectations become higher.
Okay.
Sir Medalla, question here, since you mentioned earlier that you are at least taking a look at possible second round effects here, what would be the most worrisome spillover here?
the first one, of course, is people may say, well, maybe there should be wage adjustments. And then people might say, well, since prices are higher, I might as well raise my price because I have the people selling the products whose prices have gone up may say, maybe we need higher prices because the money is now buying less.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we have to signal very clearly that we are taking the supply shocks very seriously, because we will do everything we can to prevent or minimize the second order effects.
So, sir,
Now,
can you just
yes.
clarify po? Sorry to interrupt. Have we reached a point where there's no other way right now to rein in inflation expectations from the supply side other than monetary policy and rate hikes?
Okay, obviously, we need supply intervention, right? And as you also mentioned, one way to do that is increasing imports by reducing non-tariff barriers and reducing tariffs. So those are the supply measures. But given the prices outside the Philippines are also rising because of the Ukraine war. Fertilizer is very expensive. Wheat, because of the Russia and Ukraine are major sources of wheat, so bread prices will rise. So many of the supply shocks, there's very little we can do about it. And even the increase in imports may not completely answer it. So what we want to do is, okay, prices will rise, but the rate of increase, when prices rise, they're unlikely to go back down again, and unless the supply conditions abroad change. So what we're saying is, okay, they're rising, but the rate of increase should moderate.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so what we're looking at is what we're looking at are the month-on-month increases, and right now they're high. I'll be more comfortable if our forecast is the month-on-month increases will be, let's say, 3% divided by 12, right? So we're not there yet. So if the price increases, if the price level is higher and even permanently so, as long as the increases start moderating, we will eventually reach our target.
Given that,
yes.
given that incoming Gov, is that 5% print in May already the peak, or should we be bracing for more? And is the BSP inclined to revisit its 2 to 4% target for the year?
Well, clearly, for the year, it's going to be breached. The goal is it will not be breached next year.
Okay. Sir,
But
what...
right now, if we do not act, there's almost a 50% chance that it will be breached next year. And that's the reason we're acting. There's very little we can do about the inflation this year. These are supply shocks that we cannot control. The sources are outside the Philippines. We can alleviate it by relaxing imports. But these are I think if you use an analogy of a vehicle, there's enough momentum that you need maybe say 200, 300 meters to slow down. Right? So on the other hand, if you slam on the brakes, and the road is slippery, the car may flip over, right? So that's why what we want instead is to gradually, gently step on the brake so that by next year, the car is already stable and moving at the right speed.
Sir, what is the level of interest rate that might be too high that it would stifle the growth of an economy on the mend?
That's a very good question, and my answer to that is will stay far lower than that. The reason is that the current policy rate is 2.25. So if we raise it by 50, it will be 2.75. And relative to our inflation forecast, our inflation forecast for next year is higher than 2.75. So in real terms, money is still very cheap. So we have plenty of room. The question is, how much of the room do we use?
Okay.
And,
Okay. Sir,
for
related
instance,
question.
okay, let me continue.
Sorry, sir, go ahead.
Even if the inflation pressures from the supply side normalize, we will still have to think of rate increases because the economy is already, the demand and supply are now broadly balanced. So, so sooner or later, as the economy, the demand and supply, in fact, it can happen that the demand may actually slightly exceed supply and on the aggregate. So even without a supply shock, sooner or later we have to adjust the rates upwards. Now, what's happening is because of these external shocks, sooner is what we're doing.
All right. Sir, related po to that, sorry to jump in, but I just wanted to ask, what for you is a normalization of policy? Because that's what the present governor has mentioned is what's happening in advanced economies. They've done that faster than expected, no, sir? And whereas for us, we've been accommodative. So what do you, sir, would you say, okay, we've reached the normal policy level that is, adequate for the inflation expectations?
That's a good question. And normally,
Okay, we seem to be having some technical issues here, trying to connect again with incoming BSP Governor Felipe Medalla. We'll try to get back to him later on in the show. But for now, again, you have some interesting points here raised by Sir Medalla here. But for now, let's move on to other stories now.
All right, Jess. In fact, some stories to be covering here. The Trade Department, for instance, has said that the prices of more basic commodity items may increase soon. That's as manufacturers bear the brunt of more expensive raw materials. Now, Trade Undersecretary Ruth Castello says these items include the Pinoy Tasty Bread and Pinoy Pandesal, which could become more expensive due to the rising prices of wheat flour. Detergent bars and sardines could also see price hikes. However, the Trade Department says they're still in the process of negotiating with manufacturers to stagger the increases of prices in basic commodities.
Kami na ang tumatawad sa manufacturers para sa consumer. Para pag nilabas mo yung presyo, ito na talaga yung pinaka-reasonable, ito na yung pinaka-pwede at pinaka-affordable na magiging presyo para sa consumers na hindi naman lugi ang manufacturers.
The agency also clarified that price increases in basic goods are not linked to the recent wage hikes in several regions.
Walang kinalaman ang sweldo ng manggagawa sa paggalaw ng presyo ng manufactured food products. Ang computation talaga natin is based on raw materials and production.
All right, circling back to board member Felipe Medalla, sir, go ahead po with your answer earlier to the question of normalization of policy.
At what point did I disappear? What was my last sentence?
Actually, sir, you were just beginning
You were
to
just
answer that
beginning to
question.
answer the question, sir. So you can go ahead and re-answer it.
Okay. Okay, I'll just turn off my phone so that there's no feedback.
Sure.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay.
This is live TV after all. That's what happens.
Now, as I said, with at the rate it's going, demand levels and supply levels are in the aggregate broadly balanced. And similarly, growth of both potential and actual output are also going to be broadly balanced. So in this case, what we have to revert back to normal monetary policy. Of course, we have to do it gradually so we don't shock the system. And okay, so what are those? Normally, the policy rate will not be higher, will not be lower than the inflation target. Because we don't really want negative real rates, right? So that has to go. Now, exactly when we achieve that, I would say maybe by next year. Of course, how much of that should we do this year? That's really the question. We're going that direction. How much of that we will do this year? The other one is liquidity. Because right now, banks have about more than 2 trillion of funds with us, which they can mobilize if they become very optimistic. So we have to make sure that some of that funds return to us by either our central bank bills or by term deposit facilities. So that's what we have to calibrate. Now, of course, the money supply is affected by government borrowings. So sometimes the government borrows in advance, thinks that it's timely to borrow, so it ends up borrowing and depositing the money with us. That will also reduce liquidity. So that's the other important part, the coordination between the BSP's management of liquidity and the government's management of its own borrowings and liquidity.
Okay.
So we have to be, in other words, we have to normalize both, well, as they say, Q and R, right? Quantitative policies and rate policy. Both of those have to be normalized. The other thing we have to normalize is the reserve requirement. We have a very high reserve requirement. The reason I'm afraid of a high reserve requirement is there are lenders who are not regulated by us. Therefore, they are not covered by reserve requirements. So the last thing I want to do is have a disadvantage that is the banks that are regulated by us are at a disadvantage. They're competing with guys who are not restricted by reserve requirements. So we have to reduce the reserve requirements too.
Okay.
And
To that point,
what we did to help the medium and small scale industries is we said that lending to them will qualify as reserves. That's fine, but as much as possible, we want market-oriented, non-reserve measures to do that. And we hope that the government can set up a guarantee scheme that will make the banks lend more to them.
more to that point,
So we're going to end the reserve qualification of loans to medium and small scale industries. And to prevent that from becoming an unintended tightening, we will actually reduce the reserve requirements. So those are the things that we are doing.
okay. Given that as well, Sir Medalla, releasing liquidity at this stage, is loan growth even enough to actually mop this up? At the same time, do you see levels reaching single digits by 2023 as promised earlier, or at least as envisioned earlier by BSP Governor Ben Jokno?
Well, we'll get 10 already with when we replace. Remember, we're already at 12%. So if we replace the reserve qualification of loans to medium industries, we get rid of that, and we replace that. That will more or less be 200 basis points. So we've already reached. So before the end of the year, we will already reach 10. Okay, so technically speaking, all I have to do is make it 9.9, right? Honest. So but, we will do a little bit more than that. So by next year, we're sure, we're very, very confident by next year the reserve requirement will be below 10.
All right. Again, thank you very much.
Not by 0.1, not by 0.1%.
right.
So 9.9, right?
Thank you very much,
All
sir,
right,
for
sir.
being so candid in this interview, and thank you for taking time again answering all those questions. We have Monetary Board member and incoming BSP Governor Felipe Medalla. Thank you, sir. Meanwhile, the Energy Department says it's unlikely that pump prices will breach the 100 peso per liter mark. This despite the price, some fuel products already reaching 95 pesos. That's after the latest round of big-time oil price hikes that took effect yesterday. Energy Undersecretary Gerardo Erguiza Jr. says only drastic factors will bring pump prices beyond 100 pesos per liter. He also claims the current fluctuations in the prices of fuel is not too wild.
Hindi ho namin nakikita naman doon dahil walang mga drastic na talagang factors. No? Nakikita natin tumataas o bumababa. At merong mga factors din na talaga nakikita natin na yung fluctuation kahit gumagalaw man, hindi ganun kabigat. No? And under the situation right now, existing circumstances, hindi naman aabot sa 100 yan.
Now, with the rising oil prices, more people are now choosing to commute to save money.
Now, to address the situation, one economist believes it's time for companies to adapt a hybrid work setup. Gerard de la Peña with the details.
Taxi driver Dennis Cataylo used all his coins just to fuel up his taxi. He was one of many motorists who did a last-minute gas up prior to the oil price hike on Tuesday. Dennis says he barely earns now.
Nagpakarga ka ng magkano?
1.7 sir, 1.750. Tapos ang boundary ko 1,000. Ang natira sa akin 200.
Diesel prices have increased by 6 pesos and 55 centavos per liter, while gasoline is pricier by 2 pesos and 70 centavos per liter. Prices of kerosene, meanwhile, are up by 5 pesos and 45 centavos per liter. In this gas station in Manila, diesel is almost at 81 pesos per liter. Gasoline can go as high as 83 pesos. For an economist, a hybrid work setup might come in handy.
The businesses in the Philippines should figure out a way to encourage more hybrid work so to lessen the expenditure on unnecessary travels.
Oil prices may only continue to increase in the coming weeks. The Energy Department has attributed the oil price hike to the increased summer demand in countries located at the Northern Hemisphere. Other factors include the more relaxed quarantine restrictions in China, as well as Europe's ban on oil imports from Russia. For News 5, Gerard de la Peña, we are One News.
Pausing for a quick break, but coming right up, North Star Meat Merchants shelves its IPO that's originally scheduled for this month.
More of that and other stories when Business World Live returns. Stay with us.
You're still watching Business World Live here on One News. I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Danny Laurel.
All right, Dan, markets seem to have factored in the inflation print ahead of the release yesterday, and we saw a recovery. Question is, how are they digesting the latest comments of our monetary authorities?
Well, Jess, it's just been so volatile, the same way that inflation has been. And take a look at that. After having recovered yesterday, we are sliding back down by 4.69 points. But that's just a touch. We're still nevertheless closing in on 67.50. And let's check in on who are the biggest movers dragging down the bourse. You can see pure gold down by 3 4/10%. Of course, a staple consumption stock here, but also just a mixed picture of conglomerates like AEV, SMIC, and Alliance Global in the loser board. Now, speaking of rate-sensitive sectors, just a couple to check out for here. Properties, these would be one of the most affected, if not the most affected, by higher interest rates. People will be less inclined to take loans. You can see the property index sliding down by 0.2%. Of course, this comes amid comments of expected 2 more rate hikes of 50 basis points by the end of the year. Another one is banks. This could either bode well for them or badly. It's up by 0.2% for our financials counter. Looking at the margins there, whether those will be squeezed or not with the higher expected interest rates. Now, just before we end the market report, I did want to mention one IPO has been deferred, and that is, of course, North Star, and they have cited increased market volatility amidst inflationary concerns. So it's still the same. Of course, they are, meat producers and manufacture frozen meats, and so they do have a lot to do with inflation there and consumption. This would have been a 4.5 billion peso IPO. It was supposed to list on June 24 tentatively, but they did mention that they continue to believe in the growth prospects and they hope to be able to tap the capital markets in the future at a more appropriate time, Jess.
Here are the other headlines we're keeping our eyes on. The Octa Research Group says the recent uptick in COVID-19 cases in the country is not a cause for concern, but the group reminds Filipinos to stay vigilant. Dr. Guido David told 1PHS sa totoo lang that although they are no longer seeing a surge similar to what was seen back in January as well as in 2021, it's still possible for the country's positivity rate to rise. David said Metro Manila, for one, is seeing consistent 10% uptick in cases per week, but the cause is not yet clear. That's why for now, Octa says it is not in favor of lifting the state of emergency as well as the alert level status so that the country can always be prepared for a possible rise in infections.
Ito yung parang test natin na makikita natin kung tutuloy yung cases na tumaas. Kung hindi naman, then maybe they could have the discussion na alisin na natin yung yung state of emergency, alisin na rin yung alert level. Pero again, kumbaga, let's not rush into it. Tingnan natin mabuti kung talagang hindi na tumatas yung pila ng kaso.
President-elect Bongbong Marcos's pledge to bring down the price of rice to 20 pesos per kilo may actually be achievable. That's according to Magsasaka Party List Representative Argel Kabatbat. But the lawmakers said the government may have to invest as much as 400 billion pesos to upgrade local production and revitalize rice planting activities. He said increased funding will bring down the cost of rice production and marketing. Meanwhile, the Agriculture Department is promoting the use of cheaper fertilizers to further cut the cost of producing crops. The agency is promoting the use of organic bio-N fertilizers, this as the prices of inorganic fertilizers have further increased due to the ongoing war in Russia. The DA also says it is now in government-to-government talks to buy fertilizer from China, Russia, Iran, and Malaysia to help lower the prices.
Now, the Finance Department says the government may cut the budget deficit to as low as 3.2% of GDP by 2025. That's if the incoming administration pursues the consolidated plan proposed by the agency. The DOF expects the budget deficit to track a downward trend in the medium term from 7.6% of GDP this year down to 4.1% in 2025. But the agency said the incoming Marcos administration can pull this down to as low as 3.2%, even lower than the pre-pandemic ratio of 3.4% in 2019. To do this, DOF Chief Economist Gil Beltran said the government should consolidate finances by raising additional revenues and minimizing wasteful expenditures. Beltran clarified, however, that infrastructure spending should not be sacrificed in the process. And that's a first look into the business day this Wednesday, June 8, 2022. Join us again tomorrow at exactly 9:30 a.m. You can also catch us on Signal Play. Register for a free account now at www.signalplay.com and stream One News live anytime, anywhere. I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Danny Laurel. Mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. We are One News.